Well, we'll go ahead and to see you all. Welcome to alumni. Welcome to community members who are here. I see a few folks. We're happy to welcome Luther graduates, especially back to campus for a weekend of conversation and reconnecting. My name is Marie Drews, and I'm an associate professor of English here at Luther, and the current president of the Luther's Phi Beta Kappa chapter. Thanks for being here at our 8th annual Phi Beta Kappa Symposium on the Liberal Arts. Before I have Pastor Melissa Bills introduce our speaker today, I want to say just a quick word about Phi Beta Kappa. Luther College is a Phi Beta Kappa institution, which is a significant recognition of the quality of a Luther education and the commitment the college has made to providing a stellar liberal arts experience where students pursue breadth in their learning and seek an education of the whole person. Only 10% of colleges and universities have earned recognition as Phi Beta Kappa institution, a designation that happens through a rigorous application process. Luther's Etta of Iowa chapter of Phi Beta Kappa was established in 1983, thanks in large part due to the labor of Dr. Mary Hull Moore, Emerita Professor of English. Each spring, Luther inducts outstanding seniors to be a part of Phi Beta Kappa. Inducted students tend to represent about 10% of the graduating class. But in addition to those who are inducted, the whole of the college, as well as its alumni, share the honor of being connected to a Phi Beta Kappa institution. It's a community-wide commitment we make at the college to prepare our graduates as people who will be versatile, creative, and disciplined, who will be interested in the public sphere and want to contribute to the common good. This symposium was established in 2016 as Emeritus Professor Will Bunge saw homecoming as an opportunity to celebrate the continued liberal arts contributions of Luther's exceptional alumni and emeriti. The previous 7 symposia have reflected emeriti and alumni expertise ranging from history, ethnomusicology, English and liberal arts administration, and inclusive directing, teaching, and performance studies. So now I'd like to welcome Pastor Melissa to introduce Reverend Dr. Jonathan Strandjord, our 8th annual lecturer.
Good morning. Over the course of this past year plus, Luther College has been working on a project born out of receiving a Reframing the Institutional Saga grant. So we have been doing a lot of work here at the college about thinking about our identity and our various identities, and especially these kind of core identities of our Norwegian heritage and our Lutheran heritage. As we have been considering language this year and identity and how Luther College inhabits its Lutheran identity in this time and this place, some of what we have been talking about are the gifts of the Lutheran tradition that are exemplified at Luther and other ELCA colleges. One of the things common to our shared task in Lutheran higher education is remembering our grounding in grace. This is our theological foundation from which all other things rise. We are freed by grace from the powers of sin, death, the devil, whatever you call it. We are freed by grace from our need to feel like we are striving for salvation and striving for God's acceptance. And because of that freedom, because of that liberation, we are thus freed to love our neighbor, to explore our world with reckless abandon, to study, to question, to be hospitable, to be both rooted in our foundations as a Lutheran college and open to all. A champion of these values, this grounding in grace that liberates us for learning and service. A champion of these values is our speaker today. He has spent much of his career serving the ELCA as its director for theological education. And of this work, he says, "My task is to strengthen ELCA seminaries as a collaborative network of theological education that prepares and supports the next generation of faithful, wise, and courageous leaders for the church." A recurring theme in his philosophy of theological education, at least in your public work, is this need not only for an educated clergy, but also for revitalization of our church's education of its members. These liberating arts of education, including theological education, are the shared purview of clergy and laity alike. And the work of the church and the work of education are efforts best done in community and for the sake of the community. I am thrilled to hear more about these things today as we consider liberating wisdom and the liberal arts. It is also worth noting that Jonathan's Decorah connections include many, many family members who went to Luther College. I'm getting part of the rundown: grandparents, aunts, daughters, wife. So lots of Luther connections. His grandfather, Rudolf Ofstedal, was one of the pastors in the long lineage of pastors at First Lutheran who served from 1947 to 57, and I heard you were baptized at First Lutheran. There are a few First Lutheran folks in this audience today. We are so grateful for the work that you have done on behalf of the church and the institution, and we are thrilled to welcome you and hear your words today.
I need a drink. But thank you for that very generous introduction. And it's just a surprise, and a good surprise. It's not a sudden surprise to be here. I told my wife, I haven't been this adrenalized before speaking since I preached in seminary to the whole seminary community. We did that as a senior, sort of a trial by fire. But it is a gift to be here, and as I stand here, I'm getting much more relaxed. I do want to point one person out in particular, which is wrong, but Dr. Jane Borelli is sitting in the back here. And my wife and I both had her as teacher, and she was remarkably generous, fresh, and she even agreed to sponsor our doing a J term during our senior year. Jeanette and I were married already then. Ancient warfare, Greece and Rome. And we worked harder than we'd ever worked in school before. It was much harder than doing a J term as a student. But we learned so much, and it really helped launch us into being prepared as teachers and being excited about it. But I am honored, first of all, the honor is to have been invited by Professor Drews on behalf of Luther's Phi Beta Kappa chapter to spend a half hour or so reflecting on the intersection of faith and learning at Luther College. I have read, in preparation for this, a lot of things on your website. And I read this with particular pleasure, the current version of Luther's mission statement. I appreciate its Lutheran yet non-parochial character, focusing on grace and freedom, the understanding of the college's calling, as in seeking truth, examining faith, that's an important word, examining faith, and caring for all. And then this school's commitment to liberal arts, quote, as a way of learning that moves us beyond immediate interests and present knowledge into the larger world, disciplining minds and developing whole persons who can understand and confront a changing society. This is very good stuff. Now, how might it all be summed up? How might your mission be summed up in one word? And I nominate wisdom. Wisdom with a capital W. Now, this wisdom may seem like an unlikely choice, for in modern ears, the word wisdom can have a kind of dull, conservative ring to it that triggers concern, especially among the young. that the future is not open, but hedged in by old knowledge, old understanding, old values. I hope to show, or at least point to the possibility, that wisdom is more about serving a livable future than repeating some real or imagined version of the past. Today in American culture, we do sometimes see wisdom being celebrated, often the wisdom of other cultures, which is great, but all too often exoticized and appropriated as, well, it can even just be a status-enhancing luxury good. I hope to show that wisdom with a capital W can and must include serious and generous engagement between living generations. It's not just something we do as a hobby or on the side or just sort of perform. Finally, the word wisdom can conjure up the image of that irritating know-it-all. A walking, talking Wikipedia who's apparently impossible to mute or turn off. Wisdom necessarily does involve having considerable knowledge, but the word also has a long history of pointing to the importance of having a good sense of how best to handle knowledge in the pursuit of life-giving ends. That good sense includes, of course, knowing when to speak up and when to keep silent. To everything there is a season, a kairos. Wisdom is embodied, textual, contextual, and practical, shaped by and for life in concrete human situations. It operates not only at the level of clear reflective consciousness, but also in the background, as an ensemble of assumptions, memories, hopes, practice skills, dispositions of attention, and habits of interpretation that together orient understanding, action, and judgment. Education, that is not only formal and informal, but even that accidental teaching and learning that happens in daily life. Education continually shapes and reshapes wisdom. In so doing, education, in keeping with word's etymology, draws or leads out the learner to some fuller reality. That is, to a wider field of understanding and potential action. In this centrifugal, center-fleeing movement, we see the tight connection between education and liberation. In keeping with the word's etymology, I jumped paragraphs here. There's a tight connection between education and liberation, and between both and salvation, most directly expressed in the Hebrew word yasha, which pictures a deliverance from a tight space, imprisonment, or slavery, and movement into the open. All three words, education, liberation, and yasha, point to the fact that education is not just one more activity among others, valuable to some people at some times, but something fundamentally important for genuinely human existence. It is indeed a matter of life and death. The stakes are always high with regard to education, in our own time particularly so. For as I'll try to clarify, wisdom is not simple and stable, but rather has multiple aspects which easily create competing educational projects. And in a time when human powers for good and ill are so great, when competition for resources is so acute, and when the accelerating pace of economic innovation, dislocation, and social change heightens anxieties about the continual survival of any particular community and its body of wisdom, education naturally becomes a central focus of intense conflict. Florida comes immediately to my mind. But the fact is, we are all living in such a time. 4 basic aspects of wisdom. In this next part of the presentation, I'll sketch 4 fundamental ways wisdom presents itself in everyday life. These four ways are not necessarily separated from each other. Indeed, I argue that wisdom with a capital W necessarily happens only when all four are in play. But as I'll try to show, these four aspects can also come apart very easily. And so they can and do each show up as dominant and distinct, more or less self-contained and equally mutual hostile forms of wisdom. Sketching these distinctions and exploring these conflicts just might be useful as a way to prepare to take up the topic of the final part of my presentation, the relationship between the liberal arts and liberating wisdom. In the meantime, I'll sketch the basic concern of each aspect of wisdom, the educational project it entails, what sort of liberation it accomplishes, and how it easily results in new forms of bondage and confinement that call for fresh liberation for deeper, wider education. First off, wisdom is power. I like to think of this in terms of a hand, reaching, grasping, using. Human beings are desiring, vulnerable beings with multiple capacities, including remarkable abilities not only to learn and imagine, but also to plan, invent, construct, and use. Our experience and knowledge are not passive and merely receptive, but active and thoroughly interested. And so human wisdom is naturally concerned with power. I want something, so I employ whatever wisdom I have to make it or otherwise get hold of it. I fear something, so I use my wisdom to avoid or destroy it. In both want and fear, if my existing wisdom is not up to the task, I'm a highly motivated learner. If wisdom is then increased by this learning, my power likewise expands. The history of the development of human wisdom is the story of an extraordinary expansion of power. And over the past several centuries, intentionally educational activity that serves this expansion has grown at an accelerating rate. In region after region, formal structured education has moved from being something reserved for a tiny elite towards being a universal expectation, if still far from a universal reality. Educational institutions, research programs, guilds, degrees, technologies, information systems, they've all multiplied both in number and type. Educational requirements have expanded for even very common occupations. These educational enterprises have not focused exclusively on raising the level and expanding the range of technical understanding and skills that contribute directly to the material improvement of life. They've also increased capacities both for imagination, expression, enjoyment of, and participation in culture. And along with that, resourceful participation in local, national, and global political life. But even in this more humanistic educational work, it has largely been the power aspect of wisdom that's been in the frame. The primary aim has been empowerment. Now, wisdom as power is not evil. It's absolutely essential to human life. And the liberation that comes through expanding this aspect of wisdom is obvious to anyone who through learning steps out into a wider field of effective action. But this liberation is also limited and even deeply ambiguous, for it cannot free us from fear and can in fact heighten it, because having power, having greater power, can make us, whether we're an individual or a group, it can make us the object of others' resentment, fear, or attempted manipulation. And of course, even though an increase of empowering wisdom of others can make them more useful as our collaborators or teachers, we can worry about them knowing even more than we do, and what power that might give them over us. What's more, as the power enhancements that come with education become greater, the sharper the competition over access to excellent education. And as knowledge and understanding become more thoroughly identified with power, the greater the incentive to control access to and use of them by others. The world in which we crave more and more knowledge for ourselves and fear it in others is not a happy place. And so it's no surprise that this first sort of wisdom is accompanied everywhere and always by its contrary, a wisdom which seeks to reduce craving, aiming to replace hot desire with cool detachment and examination. This second form of wisdom interrupts desire's movement to grasp, possess, and act with skeptical questions. Is this object really worth having? Is this action truly worthwhile? How can one be sure this won't be how can one be sure that this won't have the consequence of reducing future freedom? Might this move be a mistake or even a trap? So I turn our attention to wisdom that refrains from grasping, that doesn't grasp, but stands back, preferring the freedom of being empty-handed. So wisdom as suspense, following this through, refraining from grasping and using. All collections of proverbial wisdom go beyond how to effectively exercise and expand one's own power. They also give considerable attention to the importance of caution, questioning, and restraint. Just read Proverbs. Much of this counsel is straightforwardly practical and prudential, warning how power fails and desire is disappointed when a person or group does not pause before acting, first gathering and assessing all the relevant information about the situation. But sometimes critical wisdom goes much further, focusing on the importance of avoiding becoming either the prisoner of one's desires or the pawn of power systems. This form of liberating wisdom knows that freedom is not simply having the power to act in accordance with one's desires, for desires can and do conflict, with the result that satisfying one desire results in the frustration of others. Moreover, a single desire can become so powerful that it becomes an imprisoning compulsion. And in a world in which many desiring subjects vie for power to act, competing power systems come into being, each trying to recruit supporters by promising fulfillment to all who come under its banner. You're going to win so much, you're going to get tired of winning. And threatening frustration or even destruction to all who oppose it. Wisdom as suspense is suspicious of both desire and power. It seeks to liberate through the creation and preservation of critical distance. To deal with the inner contradictions and compulsions of desire, it proposes some set of bodily, social, and intellectual disciplines that give order to life, thought, and action, including not only techniques for simplifying and moderating desire, but also a core disciplined habit of reflective self-examination. To deal with the external threat of domination by power systems, an individual or community can take a posture of skeptical questioning, declining to take for granted that reality is in fact structured as the incumbent powers would have one believe, probing for overlooked and suppressed information, for illusion and deception. Now, wisdom as suspicion is as thoroughly related to matters of power as is wisdom as empowerment. Only here the issue is not how to enhance one's own power, but rather how to get loose from entangling powers. The goal is not to move into the world to grasp and possess something, but to elude capture, withdrawing from all that would ensnare, achieving true self-possession. Human desire, in addition to being powerful and complex, has no intrinsic limits. And as power has expanded throughout history in scale and scope, greatly expanding the range of imaginable experience and action, desires have been enabled to grow and multiply, increasing their complexity and ability to conflict with each other. And now in this age of unprecedented 24/7 interconnection, our attention can at any time and in any place be drawn in almost any direction. In such a time, radical disciplines that tremendously discipline desire and simplify desire, or even attempt to suspend it, become deeply attractive to many of the most thoughtful and sensitive. The self becomes itself more acutely self-conscious, more continuously a project, more thoroughly engaged in critical questioning, an endlessly open subject. This subjective radical skepticism and openness has an objective parallel. For as the same powers that have multiplied desires have grown and organized into enormous systems, the capacity of those systems to create self-justifying narratives, ideologies, and other symbolic frameworks have grown in tandem. In reaction, increasingly radical forms of criticism have emerged, employing multiplying critical tools to unmask hidden agendas, expose pretensions and contradictions, and reveal supposed freedoms as, in fact, forms of systemic bondage. Remarkable new literatures have grown up and educational efforts expended to foster the freedom of always being able to think and act otherwise. The liberation delivered by critical distance is real, but it is also severely limited and by itself limiting. For just as there are no intrinsic boundaries to desire and power, there are no bounds to criticism and suspicion. And to the degree that criticism approaches being a thoroughly consistent posture, a criticism that never quits, an absolute detachment, a physical and intellectual asceticism with no positive use for power. It closes off the springs of action, ironically, leaving the incumbent power systems effectively unopposed. But neither can power and critical distance form a natural balanced pair. One always tends to undo or co-opt the other. Wisdom is power and wisdom is criticism by themselves can form only very unstable compounds. They can be held together, though, if neither is dominant, as both are held together by a third, even deeper and more liberating aspect of wisdom. And now, since I've been talking about suspense, you're in suspense. What am I going to say? I'm going to get a drink of water. Oh! There was no wine here, so. This third, more liberating aspect of wisdom, deeper and more liberating. Wisdom is generosity, releasing, handing on. Wisdom always presents itself as, in some important sense, given, as something which is not simply produced by me, myself. Even when a feature or dimension of wisdom is seen as something innate to the structure of human being or being itself, that human structure is most naturally treated and spoken of as itself something given, that is, a gift. I have a gift. They have these gifts. When we examine the experiential wisdom that comes to us through our ordinary sense experience and everyday life in the world, we find it's freighted with a sense of inheritance, as coming to us from beyond ourselves. A gift which carries the momentum of generosity. Coming from elsewhere and from others, such wisdom can then move us and then through us to those others who could use it, each learner called to become a teacher. This flow of wisdom does more than move particular knowledge, skills, habits, and understanding from one person or group to another. At the same time, it digs channels of enduring connection through which more wisdom can flow in the future. A gift community forms that both sustains and is sustained by this handing on, this tradition. The most obvious reason why wisdom traditions persist is that the communities which have them enjoy some tremendous survival advantages through their transgenerational accumulation of knowledge of how things are in the world, how change is affected, and how deception and destruction might be avoided. Beyond this, wisdom traditions through narratives, ceremonies, songs, dances, observations, interpretations, and practices help communities become and remain alert to what is good, true, and beautiful in the realms of present experience, memory, and the imagination. This not only makes individual lives richer and more interesting, it also provides more material for gifting, more opportunity for generosity's flow. In every tradition, this survival advantage, along with this move toward life abundant, creates a powerful drive to extensive and intensive educational activity. The educational project of wisdom as generosity, while wide-ranging in every tradition and variable between them, and within each tradition over time, consistently centers in this activity of traditioning. In, with, and under its communication of a body of knowledge and cultivation of some set of skills, orientations, and attitudes, wisdom as generosity aims to encourage the cultivation of the practices of participation in tradition, in both receiving and giving. That is, learning and teaching. It seeks to foster a receptive, teachable spirit in all potential learners, and it works to motivate and make possible more generous teaching. This makes education far more than a means to certain particular ends. Education is constitutive of human ends. The liberation achieved by generosity's traditioning is profound. Indeed, it amounts to an ecstasy in the literal meaning of that word, to stand outside yourself. For finding ourselves participating in the flow of generosity, receiving tradition's gifts while at the same time dispossessed, as in not having property rights to what's come to us, being dispossessed by the needs of vulnerable others who could use at least some of those gifts. We can find ourselves drawn out of the captivity, the prison of self-concern. This is an ecstasy which takes us out of ourselves, but absolutely not out of the world. Quite the contrary, this earthy mysticism, as I like to think of it, that is genuine generosity, stations us before the other and others, a position in which we're called to be thoughtful in both senses of that word. This is a lovely double meaning. Full of thought, thinking hard, in other words, and taking thought for someone else. In such thoughtfulness, wisdom as power and wisdom as suspense can cohabit and even cooperate as both are essential in effective generosity to a vulnerable other who can use the benefits both of empowerment and critical distance, along with the traditioning, in order to enjoy the freedom of living effectively, reflectively, and generously. To use theological terms, this radical liberation can well be said to be sort of reversal of the movement of incurvatus in se, curving in on the self, a centripetal movement. Martin Luther's, that was his characterization of the vector of human sinfulness. Not human being, human sinfulness. It's that collapse in. But this freedom is also unstable and corruptible. And so it too, yes, it too, can result in the return to bondage. For even inside a particular tradition, the one we stand before more than one other person, indeed before many others, each with their own particular possibilities and vulnerabilities, not all of which between all these people are congruent, therefore pulling a responsible self in multiple directions. And each tradition, precisely to the degree it is a rich resource for life abundant, is far from simple, bearing within itself a wide variety of resources for shaping lives that can have conflicting answers to questions of what is true, good, and beautiful. And so every actual tradition is always already internally divided and contested. We shouldn't be surprised by conflicts inside a tradition. It's part of what it is. The tensions and contradictions multiply when we encounter others who've been shaped and are being shaped still by a different tradition's particularities. These tensions tempt us, not only as individuals, but also as tradition-bearing communities, or even whole nations, to solve the tension by privileging our folk, others being lesser, And so we're being thoughtful to them while treating the lesser and maybe even less than human. Once dehumanization of those people is in play, this social form of incurvatus gains energy and a perverse and potentially deadly moral force, a perverse moral force. And so in our experience of liberation achieved through generous traditioning, we see it can result in only very partial and interrupted ecstasy. A limited circle of concern hedged in by hostility, fear, and conflict with those outside the circle, while at the same time internally threatening to fall apart should any members deviate from some norm. So an ambiguous good shot through with frustrations and dangers. So we turn to consider yet another aspect of wisdom and how that might open up the possibility of fuller generosity, more enduring ecstasy. In Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, we find one of his most popular one-liners. Faith, hope, and love abide, these three. But the greatest of these is love. I mean, it's so popular you often hear it at weddings. So I'm reversing the order here, in part because I'm a fan of Johannine literature. For God so loved the world, God is love, love one another. And also because love is life-generating, and all fully liberating wisdom is motivated by love. Now, love is far from being limited to being an emotion. Genuine love shows up in the world as genuine generosity. Love gives gifts and doesn't try to control how and when those gifts are used or not used, even returned to sender or regifted. Love does not insist on recognition or reciprocity. In generosity, love flows out and forward for the sake of a lively, livable future beyond our own lifetimes. Generous love without limits looks to the future with hope, really, no matter how bad things are. It looks forward for the sake of a lively, livable future beyond our own lifetime. Generous love without limits, I already said that, but I didn't say this. A hope not just for our folk, but all humans, all creatures, all things. Such a grand, really limitless hope is sustained by faith that we are somehow or another not in this alone. That love has the last word. That living wide-awake, thoughtful lives of generous love for one another and all creation is not foolish, not in vain. So finally I get to Luther College. After I was there with the mission statement, now I'm back. Some closing thoughts, remarks on Luther College's liberal arts program and how that supports liberating wisdom. Another text from the Old Testament. Wisdom has built her house, she has hewn her 7 pillars, she has slaughtered her animals, she has mixed her wine, she has also set her table. She has sent out her servant girls, she calls from the highest places in the town. You that are simple, turn in here. To those without sense she says, come, eat of my bread, and drink of the wine I have mixed. Lay aside immaturity and live and walk in the ways of insight. Wisdom's feast. I was very impressed, delighted, when I reviewed the materials on Luther's website that describe the latest iteration of your degree requirements, majors, minors, courses, research opportunities, campus-wide conversations, common readings, and away from campus opportunities. The list goes on. I could say more. You set a very expansive table for fostering wisdom. The menu is both rich and varied, giving students the ability to dig deep into a particular field while also gaining from other disciplines. And learning in community creates significant opportunities for cross-disciplinary and cross-cultural table talk that sparks new understanding, imagination, and collaboration. The liberal arts have many virtues. But one of the primary virtues, I'd even make it the top virtue, is that they are plural and very diverse. And there is no master discipline, no all-purpose intellectual tool, no theory of everything, no one ring to rule them all. Now, this doesn't mean that there's a perfect perpetual peace between the departments, or within the departments, within the subdisciplines and specialties. We are human beings, after all. But everyone gains, especially the students, when they can experience the value of multi- and cross-disciplinary teaching, learning, and research. For one thing, they start to see things that are possible in their own primary area that they wouldn't have thought of if they hadn't been in contact with another discipline and learned some of those possibilities. I've got to find my place. But another one, and this comes from conversations with my daughter Erica, graduate. She teaches technical writing and all kinds of writing at Davis, University of California at Davis. And what she has to work with is on this. Her students and your students get a head start on developing the rhetorical skills needed to translate some important knowledge, process, or tool, or whatever from their own primary field's jargon into language that could be understood by other folks who need to understand that knowledge, process, and tool and put it to work. So in her technical writing, what she learned is that the scientists always claim about the engineers, and the engineers always complain about the scientists, and they both complain about the rest of the university. So, but sometimes, or the population. People just don't understand us. Well, she has to, with the scientists, she has to, okay, how do we translate this into engineerese? And then how do we do with the engineers and the actual people working with the products and trying to move them out, or processes or new findings? How do you make this understandable to a wider population? If we're just talking inside our jargon bubbles, it's not going to work very well. So she's worked with them, and they actually see the value when they do it. Well, your students get a head start in developing that skill. More generally, education in every individual field of learning, at least all I can think of, actually I think I can just say it, enhances the effective power of those who study it, increases the capacity to raise important questions and exercise critical reason, and increases the ability to pass knowledge and skills on to others who could use them. So, when students engage deeply and broadly in the whole life of this liberal arts community, a more truly and fully liberating wisdom is likely to grow. And when they move out into the world, they can carry that wisdom with them to communities where they can all live out their callings and perhaps even help others move toward a fully liberating wisdom of their own. It's a movable feast. Their feast really started here. Not the full start, but really got going. So many things on the table and so many people to talk with. The grand thing is that wisdom's feast at Luther isn't stuck. It isn't stuck here. It's movable. Thank you.
And then we can continue the conversation as we can move over to Quality Lounge. But maybe about 10 minutes, we can ask Dr. Strandjord some questions. And we. The room is awkward. We'll bring them. Yes, Pastor Melissa can bring the mic to you, and we are live streaming this. So if you can speak into the microphone, that would be great.
Thank you for that fine presentation. Is this thing on? Yeah, okay. I was buoyed by your optimism about your evaluation of what the students at Luther are getting this now in this era. It's the concern of some of us older people. Looking from afar, we see a diminution in the studies of languages, and language was such an important part of your speech. Do you have concerns about that? Any observations on that?
I was a classics major, and so I had Latin and Greek here. And it certainly served me in what I do. If you go on in theology, Latin and Greek are both very, very useful. And just simply, though, learning another language of any kind makes you see your own language in a different way and understand that our words are not the words. If I remember right, I don't want to get into too many details of curriculum and requirements, degree requirements, but if you come with no other language, I think you should take a language. But if you've got your own language already and you're still working on English, maybe your own language is the other language. So I think it's always good to have two. It's good to have binocular. We have binaural hearing, so we have binocular vision. That always helps us see things more clearly in the end and see possibilities in words. Actually, English opened up to me a whole new way, like the word ecstasy. I never thought of that till I was taking classics. So that would be, but languages matter, yes. But then there's other, I won't get into what should all be required. So I was glad to see that classics is still here as a minor. And both my girls did Latin while they were here. So.
Well, thank you for that wonderful talk, and especially for the insights into the power and limitation of critical thinking, which is a very valuable message for everyone who teaches, I think, and learns. But speaking of language, can you say, I don't know Hebrew at all, and you used a Hebrew word, and I wonder about that. Can you say a little more about that word?
Well, when you see in the Old Testament, when you see the word salvation, it translated into English, it is Yasha.
Can you spell that for me?
Why, in English, the anglicized form. My Hebrew is weak. I've got Hebrew, but I don't have. It's not strong enough to just do the letters, which would be written this way, the other way. But Yasha is. We have a Hebraist here. Yes.
Yes. Yod Shin Ayin, usually used in Hifil.
In Hifil. Yoshia.
Deliverance.
It's deliverance, right? Yep.
Way of thinking about that. And salvation often comes with certain presuppositions.
Right.
So the idea of deliverance.
Right. Actually, the word itself has nothing to do with sin. So it's a general term, which can be used for being freed from slavery in Egypt, from prison, from any kind of oppression. It's definitely a liberation word. It's in the same. It's doing a lot of the same work. But thank you.
Okay, but what is the word?
How do you spell it?
Or
Oh.
if it was transliterated, it would be dry, and then an SH sound and a glottal stop.
And a glottal stop. And it's much easier if I say Yasha. So it's because I don't do glottal stops, except accidentally. But
you mentioned Florida
Yes,
and public education, or
Yes.
education being contentious.
yes.
Iowa
It's
is
kind of in the air, isn't it?
Oh, right here in Iowa, I
Yep.
think that it's even worse. And so think about that. If you publish it, put Iowa as well as Florida in there. And so I'm wondering, what is the connection between a private liberal arts college that produces teachers for lots of public education institutions and public education in Iowa? What's our responsibility today?
Wow. That's a very big question. I don't think we have to teach students critical tools and critical postures even, not just whatever, or just, we have to, oh my. It's such a huge task, and it is so dispiriting right now too. But educators can't give up on this. You have to go with the hope-faith thing. Because sometimes, too, you get students who just kind of grab onto something, and they're going to just go to the limit with it. And they can end up in, like, conspiracy thinking land, where everything is, what's it, he could smell nothing but a rat. You know, it's behind everything. And no, to see political leaders weaponizing education and then trying to rewrite history, mostly by cuts, is just not honest to the students. So we need to be honest with them. We need to be ready for, I know this, we need to be ready for some pushback. I had that when I was TAing at Vanderbilt in religion courses. They're mostly Methodist, but some of them are just something else. But no, and they're really great students there too. But anyway, I can't really say much more than keep the faith here. But how can you do it so the critical tool isn't the only thing in play? And so that something is being made possible by using this critical tool. It's not just something is being eliminated. So that's all I really can think of right now. But you've asked a question I'm going to keep pondering.
Yes, thank you for your talk. I'm going to pick up on another of your sort of asides. You quoted from Tolkien, "One ring to rule them all."
Yeah.
He was, in his politics, an anarchist favoring the local. Would you just like to comment on the sort of tension between that kind of groundedness in a particular place or tradition and having a liberated, broad way of viewing the world? It must be something you've thought about in your work with Lutheranism.
Well,
And for Luther, it's an important. Luther
Right.
now has a sort of motto that President Ward has sort of put forward of grounded and global as the aims of the college's education.
So anarchism and I kind of missed the first.
But he didn't like one ring to rule them all.
No.
He liked local people sort of self-determining.
Correct. Right. He was sort of a Tolkien. So he's kind of an anarcho-syndicalist in a way. I mean, it's the Shires. Right. So what, in a world where there is power, there has to be some ways of, where power is really effective and where you have issues that are global already. We can't turn back the clock to before industrialization and before the growth of great nation states with big armies and weapons. So now how do we deal with it now? And I'll just say right now, I have an issue with anarchists who say the whole point is just take it all down right now. But now we're in that everyone's the enemy of everyone else, potentially. It's a paranoid world and a violent world. We need more order than that for life to flourish. Not just human life, but the life of all creatures. Now, some of them will survive. The cockroaches have a good shot. But
I survived
High survivability, that's right. High survivability. But most of the animals that we actually like don't. So it's not just about who likes who, but a world that's, an empire of cockroaches or a chaos of cockroaches. Power is important. Power needs to be used generously, but that means people truly engaged in democracy. A huge problem in the United States today is how many people really have almost no effective participation in politics besides maybe voting and watching one message television. That is no recipe for an orderly, in a good way, society. We need local freedoms, we do. But we also need ways where the local groups aren't just going to war with each other like the Italian cities during the Renaissance. So something in between. We don't need an absolute ordering everything. That is a problem. And I don't think you need an absolutely. We don't want a chaos among the disciplines and where they're in their own, or just in their own isolated little bunkers. Nor do we want one thing ruling them all. I don't know if that helps, but that's really interesting.
Please criticize one liberated guru, and not straying too far from Martin Luther. But Martin Luther King Jr. said,
Yes.
"We must be hard-headed
Yes.
to be free to be soft-hearted." And if we allow ourselves to be soft-headed, we will constantly trap ourselves into situations where we will almost certainly act hard-hearted.
Right. And that Reinhold Niebuhr was talking sort of in that same line, too. So it's what he called Christian realism. And finding what is, and we all have to make compromises in what we do to get anything, to make any progress. And in our defenses, too, we need to make some compromises. But we need to look, if we're purists, we will always lose or always destroy. Most of the great tyrants were purists. Some of the ones that are alive today. So, anyway, I think we need to eat.
Please do come over to Quali Lounge. We have some treats over there and some more coffee, and you can continue to talk to Dr. Strandjord. Thanks.